All right, welcome everyone to the Veritas prep version of the GMAT Club seminars on mastering the GMAT, and we're thrilled that you're able to join us. I want to thank GMAT Club for inviting us to have this opportunity and the celebration of their 10-year and million post anniversary. So Veritas Prep actually just turned 10 the same year, so it's a good year for GMAT organizations to have anniversaries. Our topic today is GMAT critical reasoning. And sort of the blueprint for, I'd say, most difficult problems that we've seen. And we're fortunate on our team to have some people who teach GMAT critical reasoning and LSAT logical reasoning, and they're pretty similar. And it's pretty neat once you've seen the blueprint behind so many of these challenging questions that in a lot of ways, once you've seen the skeleton behind them, the topic matter doesn't matter as much, and you're able to just sort of attack. And so our goal today is to show you sort of in a basic way what the blueprint is, and then generally progress up to more and more difficult questions. You can see how applying that blueprint for here's what they're really after on most strengthen and weaken questions. And that's what we're going to focus on because most critical reasoning questions have that to it. The others, in a lot of cases, ask you to draw a conclusion. And in either case, you're getting weak arguments. You're getting arguments that aren't fully supported. The wrong answer choices in an inference question or one that asks you to draw a conclusion are just weak arguments also. And so being able to spot and recognize logical flaws is critical to key on GMAT critical reasoning. And like I said, once a lot of students, and I know for myself and a lot of instructors, once we've started to see beyond the topic matter, whether this question is about politics or whether it's about science, or whether it's about a hypothetical country and its environmental problems, when you can actually see the structure of, oh, I see what the gap in logic is, that's the flaw, and get into attack mode, you can be very efficient at these, save a lot of time, you reduce your need to reread, and then your accuracy rate goes up quite a bit. And so that's our goal today, show you the blueprint behind these challenging critical reasoning questions. So since we're going to talk about logical reasoning, let's just start with sort of the foundations of logic and Aristotle's syllogism. And a syllogism is, as you can see here, it's two facts that prove a conclusion. And not to go too deep into formal logic, but we'll show you where we're going with this in just a second. So if we see that currently we have a valid syllogism up top, that all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, so therefore Socrates is mortal. And we can prove that because we know if all men are mortal, Socrates fits into that group, we can connect the dots to find out that Socrates is mortal. So that's a valid conclusion. Conclusion must be true based on the facts. Where it's invalid, where it's not a logically proven conclusion, is when they change it up, when there's a gap between the premises and conclusion. Here we have all men are mortal. Socrates is a dog, and we can't then conclude that Socrates is mortal because there's a difference between men and dogs. Now, if that seems a little bit basic, it's meant to be. But you'll recognize as we go through a progression of moderate to very difficult critical reasoning questions, that tends to be the game in many, many critical reasoning questions. And some of the hardest questions out there, I'd argue the hardest questions I've seen tend to play this game, but they just shrink that gap between men and dogs. And they make it just a little bit closer so that a lot of us, kind of to the naked eye, can't quite tell the difference. And so the gap, when we talk about minding the gap here, if you've been on the tube in London, you're familiar with that phrase quite a bit. If you mind the gap, check out that difference between men and dogs in the invalid argument, then you can train yourself to be in attack mode when you see most critical reasoning questions. What's wrong with that? Again, like we said, man doesn't equal dog. And we're going to come back to that same setup on most of these arguments. We see that, hey, wait a second, the premise doesn't equal the conclusion, or the link between the premise, this thing isn't the same as that thing. That tends to be the game. That gap between those two things aren't quite the same is the game being played in most critical reasoning questions. So let's take this and put it into more of a business context, into more of the context that you might likely see it in a GMAT type question or in your business career. Now, this argument, we're filming this in the heat of election season, so this argument has come up quite a bit in media circles and news circles over the last few months. You were to say the unemployment rate has dropped, therefore fewer people are unemployed. That's invalid. And the reason for that is unemployment rate isn't the same thing as the number of people. It's the rate. So it could be either more people are unemployed or the number of people in the workforce has changed. And so the argument, if you've been paying attention in the news the last few months, has gone back and forth. Is this really a good thing, or is it just a kind of a number cooking type thing, or an interpretation of the numbers? And so recognizing here it's still the same kind of gap as man versus dogs. It's just a little bit more nuanced. This is the type of argument you can slip past people in the news cycle. You can slip past people when asking them to make some investments or make some decisions on your behalf. Well, that's why the GMAT tests these things, is because we tend to be susceptible to those little changes between premise and conclusion. Here, this argument isn't 100% foolproof because it could be the number of people unemployed has changed, or it could be the number of people in the total pool of the labor market has changed. Unemployment rate is not the same exact thing as number of people, and so that's the gap in logic here. Now let's take this and get into minding the gap, really play around with, hey, wait a second, those two things aren't the same. And so let me pause for a second, give everybody an opportunity to read through this question, and when you do so, I don't want you to worry too much about the answer choices just yet. Take a pause through, go through and read the argument itself. Here they're asking us to strengthen the argument, so we know we're going to get a weak argument. See if you can find that gap in logic. So I'm going to pause the video, and when you get an opportunity to come back, we'll talk about that gap in logic. So how'd you do? And again, if you're in need of a little bit more time, feel free to pause the video again. But here, hopefully you're able to find this gap. This argument tends to be one that's a generalization kind of flaw in logic that I think a lot of us have seen before. Here, they're saying that these risks cannot be true because in Ireland, they were able to do this without contaminating the water supply. Therefore, we can safely proceed. Well, what's the gap? We don't know that Ireland is the same thing as we. And so when I do this question with my American students here in Los Angeles, clearly we know we're not the same thing. When I've taught this in our week-long course in London, it's a little bit closer, but still a little bit of a gap, that Ireland isn't the same thing as England, and so there's still that gap there. But regardless, the gap holds, that Ireland is not the same thing as we. And so in order to connect this gap, in a strengthening question, you want to identify that gap and then connect it. We already know what we need to see in the answer choices. And that kind of brings up the next step in minding the gap. Once you've identified that gap between premise and conclusion, hey, wait a second, this thing isn't the exact same thing as the other. If it's a strengthening question, you want to link them together. If it's a weakening question, you want to help drive that difference apart. And so in this case, it's a strengthening question we saw on the previous slide, and so therefore we want to find some reason to believe that Ireland and we are much more similar than is currently offered here. And if you know what you're looking for when you get to the answer choices, answer choice B gives us exactly what we wanted. That the original ecology of the peat harvesting areas of Ireland was basically the same as here, this country, and so it links together that gap between Ireland and what we can do. And that's really the game being played. I don't know if this is a very difficult question, but you can see items of difficulty in there, that there's a little bit of science and ecology going in there, and people tend to be a little bit intimidated by that. There's a decent amount to read, and if this is question 25 of 41 on the verbal section and your mind is a little bit worn down, it could be that much more of a struggle to process all the science and ecology and all that kind of a thing. What I want you to take away from this one is, first of all, mind the gap. Understand that gap between premise and conclusion. And then once you've done that, then know what you're looking for in the answer choices. Sort of pre-formulate a general idea of what the answer choice. You won't be able to predict it verbatim, but if you have a good idea of what the right answer needs to have, it needs to link together that gap in a strengthening question or exploit it in a weakening question, then you've got a much better shot at being successful once you get to the answer choices, because the right answer will speak to you in a way that it might not have otherwise. Now, one last thing that I'd like to point out here about where this strategy can be so helpful, even though I'd say this may be an average level, around that question. I don't think we're going to see some more difficult questions as we go. But you can see the way that they try to hide that right answer from you by not making it exactly what you want right away. By starting to talk about ecology, peat harvesting areas, you may get a little bit thrown off by scientific language or language that isn't exactly what you want. And so we call this the curveball. And if anybody here has played baseball or watches baseball, you know what I'm talking about. A lot of times the best way to strike out a batter is to throw a pitch that for at least the 60 feet from pitcher's mound to home plate, for at least half of it, doesn't look like it's anywhere near the strike zone. And then at the last second, it drops right into the strike zone. Well, that's one thing that the GMAT question authors like to do. One of our big themes in Veritas Prep is think like the test maker. Ask yourself, when I miss a question, when I get it wrong, when I'm down between the two and can't quite decide, what is it about the trap answers that makes them tempting? How are they selling me the wrong answer? And then how are they hiding the right answer? What is about that correct answer that it didn't speak to me right away? And in a lot of cases with critical reasoning, it's that the first 6 or 7 words of the right answer don't pop off the page at someone. And so if you're not really sure what you're looking for when you get to the answer choices, you're not patient kind of looking at I need to link Ireland to here, you may see the first few words and say, that doesn't make sense to me, it's not really what I'm looking for, and go away. But if you know what you're looking for, if you're on a mission when you get to the answer choices, it's much easier to kind of foul off, so to speak, to continue the baseball analogy. Say, okay, I'm not going to worry too much about the first few words until I need to, but let me get through this answer choice to realize, Ireland, virtually identical. Okay, this looks like it's going to be in the neighborhood of what I want, to link Ireland to we. So, summarize where we came from. 1, recognize this is sort of a man versus dog. Socrates is a man, or Socrates is a dog, all men are mortal. This is, we can safely proceed because they did it. Well, they and we aren't the same, we need to link those together. So it's that gap in logic. Then, once you've identified that gap, you want to be on a mission, kind of hunting down the type of answer choice you're looking for. And here, with that in mind, you can be pretty efficient on a question like this. So let's build up, and let's take a look at another question that may be a little bit more difficult. And again, our themes on these questions for all of them that we're going to go through in this mini lesson here. 1, focus on the gap in logic between premise and conclusion. So that will continue to be important. 2, see how we can use that to anticipate what the correct answer needs to have. And then 3, I want to talk about some of the traps inherent in the wrong answers and some of the ways that they hide the right answer. So those will be our goals as we go through all of these. So there's a question up on the screen here. Again, if you want to pause the video, I'm going to take a little bit of a pause here to encourage everybody to read through it. It's an assumption question, so they're asking us again to better link the premise and conclusion. We know we're going to get a flawed argument. So take a read through this one. Let's first focus on that difference between premise and conclusion, then we'll come back and attack the answer choices. So how did you do here? Now, if you notice, the answer choice here, the conclusion was prefaced by the word therefore, which should make it pretty clear that this is the conclusion. We're going to come back to why the conclusion itself, the specifics of the conclusion, are so important when we break down the trap answers on this one. Now, if we look at what's the gap in logic, well, they found bones of early ancestors. So we found bones. Therefore, we're concluding that ancestors of modern humans lived in this time period, in this place. And here's really the gap, is that finding bones isn't the same thing as proving that someone lived there. Right? You could end up with bones that were deposited there by an earthquake, or there was a burial ritual where they moved bones 100 miles away to get it closer to a temple or a landmark or something like that. So just the fact that bones were found there doesn't mean that they lived there. The fact that bones were found in that period of the fossil record isn't the same as proving that they had lived there. Now, here's where you may not have necessarily gotten this gap, but if you have a general idea that you're trying to find an answer choice that this thing isn't quite the same as that, you'll have a decent shot at getting through the answer choices as well. So one of our goals here is to train you to start thinking for that gap. This is the second question we've done. So if you don't quite have that mastered just yet, I want to at least pause and make sure you're seeing that this really is the blueprint for creating most critical reasoning questions. And I'll admit I've done this question before. The first couple times I did it, didn't necessarily hone in specifically on this, but over time I've realized that the better I am at critical reasoning, when I don't even necessarily need to spend more than 45 seconds to a minute on these, it's because that gap jumps off the page at me. Every time I see it or jumps off the screen at me, I'm like, oh, this isn't the same thing as that. So that's what we're modeling here. Now with that in mind, the fact that if we go back, the gap is that the bones being found isn't the same thing as proof that people lived here or at that time. Well, then if we go to answer choice E, that again links the premise and the conclusion. It says that the bones were already in the sediments by the time the lake disappeared. Which means if you consider the opposite, and a lot of times with these assumption questions, the correct answer isn't necessarily an advancement of your argument. It's a way to protect your argument against, hey, wait a second, I don't know that I knew that before. And you tend to find similar types of logic in data sufficiency questions as well. When you realize X is an integer, wait a second, did I know it was an integer in the previous statement? So here, it's a way to think, hey, wait a second, what if that wasn't the case before? What if those bones weren't already in the sediments? Well, that means, kind of as we had theorized before, say the bones ended up, they're saying that these ancestors lived between 2 million and 1.5 million years ago, long, long time ago. Say in the absence of answer choice E, okay, there was an earthquake 5,000 years ago, and all of these bones from way up in the fossil record went through the crevasse and ended up in this area. Well, that disproves the conclusion. Or, as I love to talk about with my classes on this one, what about some punk teenagers? They knew an archaeological dig was happening at a certain time, and so they decided, hey, we'll play with the archaeologists a little bit. We'll take these bones, we'll throw them in there, and they'll think they made some great discovery. If E is not true, the argument folds. The other nice thing is, if we go back to where we were, it helps to really connect that gap. Hey, bones being found there doesn't mean they lived there. Bones being found in that period of the fossil record isn't the same as proving that they lived there. And so this choice E exploits that gap. Now, I'm willing to predict if you gave this question a fair shot and you got it wrong, or you debated between two, the answer that you spent some time deliberating on or ultimately may have chosen is answer choice C. By far the most common trap on this question. One of the things I love to be able to do in live classes or online classes is take a poll and just get full show of hands, or online, people just click a button and show us their answers. And the statistics bear it out every time. Almost always, people are split between C and E, and in a lot of cases, just as many, if not more, people pick C as pick E. And here's the reason that people do it, and the reason that it's wrong. They tend to look at C and say, and follow me if this is your logic, well, what if the opposite were true? What if below those lake bottom sediments, so in the fossil period from before 2 million years ago, that there were other bones there? That means that other people lived there, which means that these ancestors were not the first ancestors of modern humans to live in this area. And here's where precision in language is so important. If we highlight answer choice C, the reason people miss it is that they think, okay, well, if there were bones below this level of the fossil record, then these people in question that we're talking about in the stimulus, they're not the first. And I'd argue, go back to the conclusion and tell me where it says that the first ancestors or the earliest ancestors of modern humans lived. If we look at it, it just says that ancestors lived there. And so it doesn't matter if anyone lived before or after. These people just lived there. They weren't the first, they weren't the last, they weren't the earliest. It doesn't matter. We don't need to prove that. And that goes back to this point. We're talking a lot about precision in language between premise and conclusion. The other place where you want to be very careful about precision in language, precise wording, really understanding exactly what the conclusion says is in the conclusion. There's something about trap answers and critical reasoning, if we go back and think like the test maker, where the test maker, the authors of these questions, know where your mind wants to go. One of those themes is, I call it the Delusions of Grandeur principle. In a lot of cases, we want things to be the first, the tallest, the fastest, the strongest, the last, the oldest, the youngest. We want that -est on the end of everything. And that sort of makes sense. In business, you're rewarded for having the best idea or the fastest implementation plan or the cheapest alternative to this proposal. And so that EST kind of pervades the way we think. And so that's one way that the test maker can pollute your mind a little bit. They know where your mind wants to go. And so you want to pay particular attention, one, to that precision in language between the major premise and the conclusion, man versus dog. And then also, in a case like this, make sure you double check the conclusion. Take that extra second. A lot of people ask particularly with the verbal section, there's so much reading to do. How do you prioritize what's important? How do you budget your time? The best way to budget your time is to spend an extra couple of seconds really making sure you internalize the exact conclusion, because that's where on most questions, I'd argue up to around the above average difficulty level, 60th percentile, maybe 65th, 70th percentile, the most common mistake people make is that they just miss the conclusion by one word and there's a trap answer waiting for them. So precision in language matters, particularly when it comes to the conclusion. So we've done 2 questions, kind of progressed up a little bit in difficulty, and hopefully you found right now that if you're paying attention to that gap in logic between premise and conclusion, and you're looking for precision in language and picking up a few things about where trap answers tend to come from, you're starting to see a blueprint of how they make critical reasoning difficult. They continue to shrink that gap just a little bit between premise and conclusion, and then they use some of these things. They try to hide the right answer. They try to sell you the wrong answer to make your job a lot more difficult. In any case, anticipating what the right answer needs to have and kind of being on a mission by the time you get to the answer choices is important. Now let's take a look at one more question, and I'll preface this one by saying this one comes from our advanced verbal strategy lesson. This is designed to be pretty much all questions that are people hoping to score in the verbal section at or above around the 75th, 80th percentile. These are the kinds of questions that you need to be able to get right more often than not. And so this is designed to be a difficult question, and so let me give you that preface at first. The other thing I want to mention is that what makes this question difficult is that it's wordy and that the answer choices are convoluted. They're negated. They don't quite pop off the page. And so the key to success on this question, as with many difficult questions, is to be able to recognize that gap between premise and conclusion. That same Socrates is a dog, all men are mortal gap, just that much more shrunk. So with that in mind, if you want to pause the video, take a read through this question. It's an assumption question, so again, our goal is going to be to link the premise better to the conclusion. And a lot of times with assumption questions, what's tough is there's not a lot of negation and kind of awkwardness in the answer choices. You will want to be on a mission by the time you get to the answer choices. Pause the video and give this one a try. And once you've had a chance to do that, resume the video and we'll talk about how we can use what we've just learned to attack what I think in most people's minds is a very difficult problem. So, you've had a chance to read through this one, and a few things I think stand out when people read this one. One, if you got all the way through to the answer choices, I think a lot of people tend to find if you get to the answer choices here without an idea of what you're looking for, what type of information that right answer choice has to have, what gap it's exploiting or linking, then you're going to be in trouble. This one wears people down. I gave the baseball analogy before. I'm actually doing some one-on-one tutoring with a guy who was in one of my classes who played Major League Baseball, and he confirmed the analogy that in a lot of these cases, it's sort of like pitch count in baseball. They can wear you down, and just sort of like a pitcher in baseball. If they keep fouling it off and just wear you down, eventually they'll get you. Your head starts spinning, and you can't focus. And like a great pitcher in baseball, a Detroit Tigers fan, the Tigers their pitching got worn down in the World Series. They couldn't get a starter past the 6th or 7th inning, even though most of those guys pitched well. It's because the GMAT has a couple of aims. They can get you by just beating you with a tricky question, or they can get you with questions that wear you down. And here, this is one of those that wears you down. It wastes a lot of your time and energy and focus. And so one of your goals on difficult questions has to be you need to be on a mission by the time you get to the answer choices. Otherwise, you'll reread the answer choices. If you read each one of them twice, then by the time you get back to the top, you've kind of forgotten what the stimulus is about, and you've got more questions to go. And so make sure you're focused on these. And if you don't understand that gap between premise and conclusion, you're probably going to be in trouble before you get to the answer choices here. The other thing that I think is interesting about this one is that gap is very subtle. We mentioned that the more you narrow that gap from man to dog to here, what that gap really is, and follow me on this one if you see it, is that the percentage of released criminals arrested under the intensive supervision is the same thing as it is under routine supervision. So the percentage of people arrested is what the statistic is, that major premise. Now the conclusion they're trying to draw from that is that this intensive supervision is no more effective at preventing criminals from committing additional crimes. And I think in many of our minds, these two are pretty well similar. I kind of grew up, I went to a program called Safety Town where they talked about law enforcement. I was 4 years old. They taught us on tricycles how to pay attention to the rules of the road and law and order and all those kind of things. In my mind, as someone who was raised well, you commit a crime, you get arrested, so don't commit a crime. But those two things, while very similar, are not the same thing. You can commit a crime and not be arrested. As a Tupac and Biggie fan, I know that there were crimes committed. Those men were murdered, and still no one has been convicted. One guy got arrested when it came to Tupac. But regardless, you can commit a crime without being arrested. So those two things are very similar, but they're not quite the same thing. And so if you recognize that that's the gap in logic, you have a fighting chance when you get to the answer choices. I'd still argue the answer choices are a little bit convoluted and difficultly worded, and there's some negation and everything involved. But if you look at it and say, wait a second, even if the percentage arrested is the same under both, it could mean that people are committing more crimes under routine supervision. And pause and think about that for just a second. It would stand to reason that the more intensively we're watching someone, intensive supervision means we're watching you like a hawk. Routine is maybe you have to check in once a week, or we have somebody drive past your house every now and then. It's more likely that we catch people if they're under intensive. Anytime they do something we're watching versus routine. So if you think about it that way, hey, wait a second, the flaw in this argument is that you could, 1 out of every 10 people under either type of supervision, percentage arrested, could be arrested. But it could be that 5 out of those 10 under routine supervision committed crimes, we only caught 1 of them, whereas we pretty much catch everybody under intensive supervision. So if you know in your mind that that's really what you're looking for, is that the gap is the difference between arrested and crimes committed, the only answer choice that links those together is answer choice C. It says the proportion of arrests to crimes committed was not significantly higher for intensive than routine. Now, that wording is difficult. Was not significantly higher is that negation they tend to use in assumption questions, and so that is a way of hiding the right answer. Assumption questions tend to do that particularly well because they allow themselves to be something that isn't an advancement of your argument. It sort of takes away a flaw in the argument. They use a lot of those, was not this, was not greater than, was not less than, was not significantly higher than. So keep that in mind. Assumption questions tend to hide the right answer pretty well, but if you knew what you were going for when you got to the answer choices, you wanted something that linked arrests to crimes committed and said that those two are about the same thing, they're about equivalent, then saying arrest to crimes committed was pretty much the same for both. That links those statistics together and allows us to better draw this conclusion. So to summarize what we can learn from this one. This one I do feel is one of the more difficult questions that I've seen out there because of that negation, because of the way that they can hide the right answer from you. But if you pick up on that slight difference between the statistic that they're giving and the conclusion, that arrested is not the same thing as crimes committed, then you know what you're looking for when you get to the answer choices, and you've got a pretty good shot at this one. If we just take one quick look back at the answer choices, and you kind of see what you might have been thinking when you were reading through those, they're dense, there's a good amount of negation and proportionality, a little bit of math to be done, and so there's a lot going on in the answer choices. But if you know what you're looking for, if you've recognized that gap, you're in that much better shape. You can be a lot more direct when you get there. And so let's take an interim summary, and then we'll do one more challenge problem on this. Difficult critical reasoning questions tend to have that same game that they're playing. Man versus dog. Premise doesn't say the same thing as the conclusion. They just hide it. They make dense, kind of convoluted subjects. They make really tricky answer choices that kind of make you reread them and have some negation and things in there. They use a smaller gap that you might not notice. You might see that arrest crimes committed, pretty much the same thing. unemployment rate, number of people unemployed, pretty much the same thing. So they tighten that gap a little bit, and then they hide it. Your strategy, mind the gap, and once you've found that gap, anticipate what type of answer choice do I need? Do I need to link these two together? Do I need to exploit them and drive them further apart? Either way, once you've seen that gap, this tends to be the blueprint for quite a few, I'd say most difficult strengthen and weaken questions have that gap in them. And if you can learn to play that game, then you can almost see the skeleton behind it. Okay, here's the premise. It's not going to say the same thing as the conclusion. It'll be close, but the words will be just a little bit off. Okay, here's where the game is played. So with that in mind, let's take a look at one more question. This one will be similar to what we've done. I don't know that it graduates in difficulty. I think it's probably on par with the previous one in terms of the proportion of students that I've seen miss this one over the years and some of the debates that we've talked about here. And so take an opportunity to read this one. And actually, I'm realizing I went to the direct bottom of the slide when I was typing these out. E's a little bit cut off. So let me give everybody an opportunity to read this, pause the slide. It'll look a little crude, but right before I start talking, just because I know I'm missing, I think, an entire line here, I'll go back to the smaller version in just the full window pane, and then pop it back up. So if you want to start reading here, read it here, it's a little bit bigger, and then I'm going to give it a second, pop it up in the smaller one so you can see the whole slide, and then we'll come right back to it. Okay, and if you do want to see it in its entirety in the full screen mode, fix that, popped it right back up. So feel free to take a look at version control between Mac and Windows and different versions. Don't always talk to each other well, so sorry about that. Now that you've had a chance to read the argument and the answer choices, let's see how you did. Were you able to see that gap in logic between what the city official's conclusion was, and that's a little bit tricky on this one too, because he doesn't really give a direct conclusion, a therefore, a thus, a we should, anything like that. But do you see that gap between his conclusion and the facts, the premises that he gives? Well, first, if we look at what his conclusion is, he's directly attacking what the citizen said. And the citizen uses a fact to lead to a conclusion. And for tricky conclusions, we talk about what we call the why test. If anything is given as a fact, it's not the conclusion. Conclusions have to have a reason why. And so if you're trying to break down, hey, which sentences are the conclusion, which are the facts? Ask yourself why for each of these statements. And if it gives a reason, it could be the conclusion. So we look at the citizen's first statement. Each year, a new record has been set. Doesn't really give any reason why. It's just given as a fact. But then he says there's a decreasing ability of law enforcement to prevent violent crime. Why? Well, I'm basing that on this fact that I have. So you can kind of play the why test there. The city official just lists a couple of facts. You overlook this. In fact, that is true. So what's he trying to do? What's his conclusion? His conclusion is to say, no, citizen, you're wrong. We're actually doing a pretty good job of fighting violent crime. And so if you see that is the conclusion, and then look at the premises that he gives, I'd argue here's the gap in logic, that violent crime is what the conclusion's about. That's what these two are arguing about. And he cites one type of violent crime, the murder rate. But murder is not the same thing as violent crime. They're very similar, but one is a subset of the other. Murder is also in there with aggravated assault and armed robbery and all those kinds of things are violent crime. Murder is just one type. And so if you recognize that, hey, wait a second, these two aren't the same thing. Unemployment rate versus number unemployed. Arrests versus crimes committed. Man versus dog. Murder versus violent crime. Very subtle difference, but there's a definite difference there. Well, if you have that in mind, you'll be able to shake off the curveball offered by the correct answer here. So if we see that that difference is there, murder is not the same thing as violent crime, then we get to answer choice E. And again, let me make a quick editorial move here. Again, this looked beautiful on my desktop, but wasn't quite what needed to be. So let's look at answer choice E in its entirety. There's a curveball here. If the health care received by assault victims. Well, once you start reading about health care, I think most people think, geez, health care, I thought we were done with the election, Obamacare, Romneycare, we're done talking about health care. Why are we talking about it? This is about violent crime. This is about the murder rate. But if you know you're looking for, it's a weekend question, and so you're looking for something to exploit the fact that, hey, wait a second, murder and violent crime aren't the same thing. Then you'll read further and realize that, hey, if the health care received by these assault victims had been of the same quality, the murder rate would have been a lot more. Which means, hey, you didn't prevent the violent crime. You were just lucky that the victim didn't die. Because the victim didn't die, and that's no fault of your own. He was still savagely stabbed, beaten, whatever. Then you didn't prevent the violent crime. You just got lucky on one rate. And so E weakens that and says, yeah, the murder rate was down, but that doesn't mean that violent crime didn't stop. Actually, there's a ton of violent crime. It's just you cherry-picked the one statistic that looked good in your favor. And that brings up one other sort of big point on minding the gap. If you can see that difference between premise and conclusion, you can think critically. And that really is the name of the game, critical reasoning. If you learn to think critically about arguments, about, hey, wait a second, he gave a statistic. I bet he picked the one statistic that works in his favor. I'm looking for an answer choice that might exploit that. Here, he picked the murder rate, but he's trying to make a conclusion about something bigger than the murder rate, the violent crime rate. All right, I have a feeling that there's another type of crime that he didn't prevent. And so if you're thinking that way, thinking critically, hey, here's the gap, and I bet there's an alternative explanation that shows that this one statistic is an outlier, or it's only one of many statistics. So again, you can see minding the gap is critical. Recognizing that difference between premise and conclusion here allows you to attack the right answer and to shake off this curveball. If the healthcare received, that tends to throw a lot of people. A lot of people don't like those first 5 to 7, 8, 9 words and just say, oh, there's nothing going on with E. Then they go back and they pick an answer choice that somehow speaks to them. In this case, if you knew what you were looking for, those two aren't the same thing, you're much more patient with E because you're waiting to see if it develops into what you want it to be instead of just trying to scan each answer choice and get rid of some that seem in scope, out of scope, that kind of thing. And so minding the gap can be critical to success on critical reasoning. So that's our mini lesson on the blueprint behind GMAT critical reasoning questions. So let's summarize where we were, and then we'll give you some strategies to take forward. Remember, and some of this is a rehash of what we just did before, difficult critical reasoning questions aren't that much more difficult because of the logic. It's just they shrink that gap, they hide it, they do a good job of putting it into subject matter that isn't totally familiar to you or that most people don't gravitate toward. They do a good job of putting a little bit more text there. They make the gap small enough that most people don't notice, or many people don't notice. And they make it difficult at the answer choice level. They know that if you aren't sure what you're looking for when you get to the answer choices, the more dense, the more convoluted, the more negated with that this was not the case as opposed to this was the case the answer choices are, the more they can waste your time and throw you off the scent of a correct answer. So as critical reasoning questions, particularly strengthen and weaken, get more difficult, they stay the same. That blueprint tends to be about the same. They just shrink the gap and make it that much harder for it to jump off the page at you or jump off the screen at you. They reward those who know what they're looking for and get into attack mode. So note that the premise isn't going to equal the conclusion. If it's a strength and weaken question, there's going to be a little bit of a gap there. That's your foothold. That's where you want to go. And then beware this precision in wording. We saw that with a few of these questions, that there's one word off. That if you get the conclusion one word off, or you're not quite there, even with the conclusions, this happens a lot when they're asking you to draw a conclusion. You may make the same mistake as man versus dog, just one word off. Precision in wording counts. And what's important to take away from this is you know where to be precise. Even if you see well over 100 words or so in any of these stimulus statements or entire questions, you know which ones to focus on. Precise wording in the conclusion, and then what's the major premise that leads to it? Are those two things the same? So that way you don't have to press every word of every sentence, every answer choice, and all that. You kind of know what you're looking for and where to focus your time. Now, obviously, this will take some practice. And so we invite you to continue to practice, to look out for critical reasoning questions in the official Guide for GMAT review series, in the forums at GMAT Club. And if you follow the links through GMAT Club, you can see our new question bank. We have quite a few questions there to practice on. And so there's plenty of opportunity to practice. This does take a little bit of time, but hopefully what we showed you here was as questions get more and more difficult, the blueprint remains the same. It's that gap between premise and conclusion. If you can train yourself to look for that first, to focus on that, you can be pretty successful on most critical reasoning questions and save a lot of time in doing so. So we pause before we sign off. Thank you for taking the time to work with us. If you're interested in a little bit more, I'm also a host of some of the Veritas Prep free seminars, and there are links to those. So we do a little bit more with a couple other critical reasoning questions in some of our free seminars. So hope to see some of you there. And best of luck to everyone with your GMAT studies, with your MBA preparation. And we hope that Veritas Prep can be a part of helping you out. And we invite you to converse with us in the forums and visit our website for more resources. So thank you.